It's a great honor to be here, and I really want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this very moving event. And now, after hearing Sahar speak, I'm so angry. I really don't want to give my perspective, but I think because I think my aim with my perspective is maybe to try to give a little bit of hope, to do a bit more optimistic perspective on the occupation and colonialism. Sahar spoke to us about people's stories, and she ended by telling us that the tools that we have in fighting for Palestinian freedom, one of the most important tools is justice. What are the tools of the colonizers? The tools of the colonizers are weapons, and that's what I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about the Israeli arms industry. And I think a lot of things have changed in the history of the Israeli arms industry, and these changes can bring us a little bit of hope. They show that the Israeli arms industry and the Israeli colonial system is starting to have cracks in it. The Israeli arms industry is actually older than the State of Israel itself. It started in 1933, and it went on through many major changes in history. I think it's interesting to look at how it changed in terms of its purpose, because, and that's where privatization comes in, because it started as an industry intended not to make money, but rather for the ideological purpose of arming the Zionist militias and then arming the Israeli military with the best weapons and the most advanced technologies for political reasons. Any leftover money that they had from exporting unnecessary weapons were used for research to develop newer weapons in order to repress Palestinians more effectively. This has changed. And today, the Israeli arms industry is mainly focused on making money, on making profits, just like any other sector of the economy. But it's not just like any other sector of the economy, because when you have arms companies trying to make a profit, their only way for them to make profit is through war, through conflict. And that is something that we need to be aware of. And the three crises that I think describe the history of the Israeli arms industry, the first one is the crisis of the United States aid to Israel, and I'm going to expand about this, and how the Israeli arms industry adapted to this crisis by changing the products that they produce and focusing mainly on things that complement rather than compete with US technology. Then the second crisis is the crisis of the end of the Cold War and the loss of a lot of demand for Israeli weapons, and the way that the Israeli arms industry adapted to this is through the so-called counter-terrorism technology, the war on terror, and specializing on what is known as homeland security, surveillance, and so on. The third crisis, those of you in the front cannot read it maybe, is the current one, Palestinian resistance. There is, and this is where the crisis for which the Israeli arms industry has no solution. So these are the four big companies that dominate between 50% and 80% of all the Israeli arms exports, depending on how you count it. And it's interesting to see that these four companies, three of them are government-owned. Only Elbit Systems on the left bottom corner is private. But just 2 months ago, it was announced that Elbit Systems will buy IMI, the one you see on the top right corner there, and that would completely change the Israeli arms industry distribution. And by making it mostly a private sector rather than a government sector, it gives a monopoly to the private sector on selling weapons to the Israeli army. That increases the price of all the weapons to the Israeli army, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens when the Israeli forces have to pay more for every bullet they shoot, every missile they fire, and so on. Israel is obviously not one of the top, not the top weapons exporter in the world. It's a major arms exporter, but this data that maybe some of you can read, it may be a bit small, I don't know, is a bit old. It's from 2008 to 2011, and since then Israel has actually dropped in comparison to other countries as a major arms exporter. Here it's number 7, the seventh biggest arms exporter in the world. The United States is, of course, number 1. I think it's interesting, though, to see that if we do arms export per capita, per person, Israel is actually the biggest. And that's not because every Israeli is exporting weapons. That is, of course, not the case. But it does mean that the sector of the arms industry for the Israeli economy plays a bigger role than in any other country in the world. Still, there are bigger sectors in Israel. There's no country in the world that most of their income comes from selling weapons. But in different countries, it's something between 1% of their exports to 9% of their exports. In Israel, it's about 11% of the exports. And the biggest customers of Israeli weapons over the years is a very interesting list. And this list, oh, I see that the names of the countries are not really visible to, to some of you at least. No. So I will very quickly just tell you that the biggest customers of Israeli weapons over the years have been the countries that had the highest levels of internal inequality, were engaged in severe civil war, or were under international arms embargoes. Because for many of the big arms companies in the world, like the American ones, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, they don't really want to risk their reputation by sending weapons to some small militias in Latin America or to South Africa under apartheid, or today to Myanmar, previously known as Burma, where the junta is using these weapons against the Rohingya. They don't want to risk their reputation. These are also not the customers that can pay so much money. But for Israeli companies, they do go into this niche and export to these countries. But then comes the US aid to Israel. And I think this is really something that for us to pay close attention to. I think it's very wrong, and especially among the left or the pro-Palestinian solidarity group, we have this image sometimes as if Israel controls the United States, as if the White House is a puppet for Netanyahu. And that's absolutely not true. And if we look at the arms industry, that's where we see exactly what is the interest of the United States to give Israel so much support. So much political and economic support. In fact, this political and economic support is something that is very much concentrated on the benefit of certain sectors of the US economy, and especially the arms sector. And there are many stories, many important events in the history of the Israeli arms industry, especially after 1973, when US aid to Israel started to come in very large numbers, that whenever the Israeli arms companies tried to develop some kind of technology that would possibly compete with the United States, the Pentagon put an end to it immediately, no matter how much damage and how much loss it caused to the Israeli companies. The famous examples are when Rafael, one of the Israeli companies, tried to develop an anti-tank missile, and even more famous is when IAI, Israeli Aerospace Industries, tried to develop an attack airplane, a fighter plane that would compete with the F-16. And at that moment, the United States did not tolerate it, and they used a lot of pressure and a lot of threats. And after this plane, after billions were already invested in it, it was scrapped. It was destroyed because and that is one of the things that the State of Israel is not allowed to do. Because many Israeli weapons include US technology, that gives the US also the ability to stop deals if they don't like them, and to prevent them. And then sometimes Israel has no choice but to pay compensations to countries they've already signed an agreement with. I think a very interesting story for us is when Palestine appealed for recognition as a state to the Security Council of the United Nations. And maybe you remember, there are 9 votes that they needed to get, and everybody thought that Nigeria is going to vote in favor of Palestine. And in the end, Nigeria suddenly decided to abstain for some reason. Why? Well, then it became apparent that Israel just signed a deal with Nigeria to deliver 150 attack helicopters. So now the reason for Nigeria's abstaining became very clear, except that the United States, President Obama at the time, said, no, but I didn't authorize that Israel will sell these attack helicopters to Nigeria. The helicopters were stopped. And next time that Israel will try to do a deal like that in order to block a Palestinian initiative in the UN or in any other international forum, the countries will know that without approval from the United States, the deal could be canceled in the last moment. This is the aid the United States gave to Israel over the years. I think there's something very interesting that maybe not everyone is aware of. What I did with this graph, I added inflation to it. It's based on current prices rather than on the just number of dollars. And because the dollar today is not worth as much as it was when aid started 45 years ago, we can see that actually aid reached a peak when Israel signed the peace treaty with Egypt. And after that peace treaty, aid is gradually diminishing from year to year. Israel is still the biggest recipient of US aid in the world. But if we look closely, we see that the civilian part of the aid is zero now, or almost zero. And almost all of the aid is military aid. And military aid is not something that helps the lives of Israelis in any way. No one in Israel is more rich because they have an F-16 flying over their head. It is actually a voucher that the Israeli government has to use to buy weapons from American companies. It is actually a subsidy for the US arms industry, something which is very easy to forget. So that explains a little bit who really profits from this aid and what is it really used for. And one of the last things that President Obama did before leaving office was to change the aid agreement with Israel in a way that deprives Israeli companies gradually, not immediately, but starting from 2019, it's going to come into effect, deprives them of the right to use part of the US aid to buy from Israeli companies. This is a privilege that only Israeli companies had for about 20% of the aid. Now it's going to be 0%. So if we really want to understand why so many United States politicians say that they will always support Israel and they stand with Israel no matter what, it's not because they're Zionists, it's because of this graph over here, which shows us the arms lobby in the United States. And the problem with the arms lobby, Boeing, General Electric, Northrop Grumman, and so on, is that it's not very legitimate for US presidents to say, I've just spoken with Lockheed Martin and I promised them that there's always going to be war in the Middle East. There's nothing for you to worry about. You can't get away with saying something like that, but you can go to AIPAC, the Israeli lobby, and say we will always support Israel. Well, Israel is the occupier. The message is very clear to all the arms industry. Support the occupier, there's not going to be peace. So then these companies can trust that their profits will continue. And in this big pie chart, I put AIPAC just to show you what it is, 3 million out of 82 million. And also there's one Israeli arms company here, the Elbit Systems, which I just put it here because it's Israeli, but its lobby budget is quite small with $300,000, not even $1 million. How many people here have seen the movie, The Lab? Yeah, it's very recommended, this movie. It really shows how the Israeli arms industry works and this whole idea of the battle-tested. This is how Israel has responded to the crisis of the end of the Cold War by showing, well, we have the advantage because we can test our weapons on actual human beings. Our missiles, our cameras were tested on people. What other arms companies cannot easily say. And after every invasion of Gaza, there is an arms fair where Israeli companies show these are the weapons that we've just used in Gaza and showing videos and so on. And that's something that gives them an advantage in selling those weapons. This is actually an idea that sells a promise that the Israeli technology is not the technology that can kill the biggest number of people. We are horrified when we see the Israeli army executing Palestinians and killing them in large numbers, but we're not seeing the Israelis using the technology of heavy artillery and tanks to wipe out thousands of people just in order to kill as many people as they can. What we see is the Israeli military and police using very sophisticated technology and very expensive missiles and drones and so on to try to claim that they have the ability to hit the people they are trying to target and nobody else. This is the so-called counterterrorism technology and the homeland security technology, which is not necessarily supposed to be more lethal, but the promise of this technology is we can give you the way to avoid political or social compromise. That's why the biggest customers of Israel are countries like Brazil and India, because you know, in Brazil, in the city of Rio de Janeiro, there is a favela, one of the neighborhoods suffering from severe social problems and poverty, which the Brazilian forces call it the Gaza Strip. They call it the Gaza Strip because there they use technology that they import from Israel, checkpoints and drones and cameras and so on, in order to control that population. And the Israeli companies are saying, use our technology so you don't have to deal with the problems in the favela. Instead of really finding long-term solution to the drug problems, to the crime or whatever, or listening to the population there, what are their demands? No, you don't have to think about them anymore. You close them with a fence, you close them with a checkpoint, just like we did in Gaza. That's why they need the Iron Dome, so that the people in Gaza will be also closed from above. And now they're working on the anti-tunnel technology, so they'll be also closed from below. So Gaza will become a three-dimensional bubble, and nobody has to know what's going on inside. This is the promise, what Jeff Halper calls warehousing people with all this technology. But has the promise succeeded? Okay, so here are some pictures of Israeli weapons. One interesting thing that is happening now in the Israeli society, and this is something very much related to what Hanin Zoabi told us yesterday, when she said the elites in Israel are changing. I completely agree. That's a very important point. And they are changing like they change in every colonial society. Every colonial society has a generation crisis, because you have a generation of the people who established the colony, and they're very intelligent people who developed very complicated system to control the native population. This is the Israeli security elite, people who took the time to learn Arabic, to know something about Palestinian culture, to know something about how to divide Palestinians into factions and control them. But then comes another generation, a younger generation of Israelis, who say, well, it's beneath our dignity to study Arabic and to get to know the Palestinians. We want to control them because we are better than them. This is the kind of colonial logic that is no longer very intelligent and no longer very efficient. That's why we heard from Sahar that they're using Google Translate to translate Facebook posts of Palestinians. This is something that really shows what happened to the Israeli intelligence if they have to use Google Translate. This is a new kind of security elite that is emerging in Israel. People who are relying on their technology, but have actually no idea what are Palestinians, what do they think, really. And that is why we can see all these changes in Israeli society. We see also that the Israeli society becomes demilitarized. I know this is a point, gradually demilitarized. I know I'm already seeing some of the faces in the crowd say, what are you talking about? But we have to understand there is a difference between militarism and violence. You can have a society which is violent but less militaristic. Israel is still more militaristic than Ireland, of course. But let's look what's going on. To conscription. Conscription used to be over 80% in the 1980s, and today it's under 48%. That means most young Israelis, when they reach the age of 18, they don't serve in the army. Find many different ways to get out. Many of them are right-wing and racist, and they support occupation, but yeah, let somebody else do it. Okay, this is how demilitarism looks like. And of course, another very important aspect of this is this kind of vigilante violence. And Sar, you mentioned El-Or Azaria, who murdered Abdel Fattah al-Sharif in Hebron. We've all seen this picture. This is an example of this kind of mob mentality. Because what this soldier did is not just commit murder. There are hundreds of Israeli soldiers who commit murder against Palestinians. There are hundreds of Palestinians who are murdered on a regular basis. But he did it in defiance of orders. And when he was charged, instead of saying what every Israeli soldier is supposed to say in this situation, you say, well, I'm following an order that I have to protect myself if I feel threatened. And I felt threatened, so I opened fire. He didn't say that. He refused to say that. At some point he did during the trial because his lawyers recommended it to him, but it doesn't matter. He contradicted himself and basically said, no, that's not the point. The point is, I am Jewish, he's not, I can shoot him, he can die, and that's it. But this is, of course, the kind of logic that disintegrates the discipline of the military and makes Israel into a less militaristic society, because the violence is no longer organized according to rank and according to battalions and so on. The violence is now people saying, well, I can use violence just because of my identity, not because anyone gave me an order. And then people start to carry their own weapons and do what they want. Violence becomes individualized, violence becomes privatized. And private security companies start to play a very important role. I still, even with this process of demilitarization, like I said before, the Israeli arms export remain more important to the Israeli economy than in any other country. Here we can see how a comparison of the arms exports to GDP, and Israel has 1% of their GDP just from arms exports. 1% is not a lot, but it's more than any other country in the world. So privatization of security is something which is changing the Israeli military, and it goes through the Israeli military industry. The Palestinian Authority itself, from the point of view of Palestinians, that's a different story. And I have to say this because I'm Israeli. And it's important for me to stress this issue that I don't think when Yasser Arafat signed the Oslo agreements, he thought to himself, oh, I'm going to continue the occupation for Israel. But from the point of view of the Israeli government, it was very clear. Yitzhak Rabin, when he signed the Oslo agreements, he explained to his own cabinet, we need somebody to do this job for us, this policing, colonial policing, although he didn't use that word. But what he did say, we need somebody to do this for us without the interference of the Supreme Court and without B'Tselem, meaning without the human rights organizations. And he said, let the Palestinians do it for us. Let the Palestinian Authority be our private police force in the occupied territory. And that actually is the largest privatization in the history of the Israeli security, because there are so many Palestinian security, and they've taken over so many roles of the Israeli police and military that were undertaken before. But then, of course, you have also the private security companies coming in to fill the void that the Israeli army and police are no longer filling. And that means if the police is saying, we cannot create security for people on the street, if you want security, hire a private company. And these private companies come in, and you can see them all over the place, in shopping malls, in the public transportation. That increases the cost of living. And maybe some of you have heard about the cost of living crisis in Israel and how it created mass demonstrations as well. And you also have the crisis for the Israeli security elite. These people who are not very successful when they retire from military service at a relatively early age in Israel, as colonels, generals, and so on. And they can't all become politicians and mayors like they used to. That is also part of the demilitarization of society. It used to be that a very large proportion of the Knesset, of the government, were military officers. Now it's not so often. And now there are other elite groups that try to get in. People from the economic elite, so CEOs of companies, for example. So these officers, as a way to get out, they start to found their own security companies and go outside of Israel and compete in the international market, which sometimes makes them and become sort of mercenaries, you know. And you see that growing phenomenon of Israeli security companies operating around the world and offering this Israeli expertise. But what is this expertise really? Yeah, here's an Israeli soldier, or something between a soldier and policeman, because in Israel the distinction is not clear, in a checkpoint, seeing a Palestinian that he wants arrested, and he's pointing to the Palestinian policeman who is in the center of the picture and say, arrest this man for me. And you can see the Palestinian policeman doing that. So if we want to see how privatization of security looks like. Okay, but now I want to talk about the crisis of the Israeli security elite, and this is what gives me at least a lot of hope, and that brings me back to this promise. Promise of the Israeli military industry is we can provide technology that solves political problems, or at least avoids them. Instead of compromise, let's just bring in more sophisticated missiles. But here's the problem. Have the Palestinians been subdued? Has the Palestinian resistance stopped? It doesn't matter that the Israeli military brings in more and more generations of new sophisticated equipment. Palestinians continue to fight, and they continue to struggle with means that sometimes their technologies defeat the Israeli technology. For example, when the Israelis bring in very sophisticated snipers in Gaza, Palestinians create smoke by burning tires, and they shield themselves from the snipers. That's a very sophisticated way of using technology that the Israeli army doesn't really know what to do with. And that really creates a problem which the Israeli customers of Israeli weapons start to notice. And they're starting to ask questions, especially after the invasion of Gaza of 2014, 4 years ago, when the invasion lasted for 51 days, cost a great deal of money, not just, of course, for the Palestinian side in Gaza, it was a complete catastrophe, but for the Israeli economy, it was certainly not cheap. 51 days destroyed the Israeli tourism sector for that year. And it took about 2 years for the tourist number just to recover to what it was before 2014. And then countries like Poland and Brazil and India were asking the Israeli arms companies, why do we need to buy this missile or this drone from you if in the end you can't win? You're not winning. The Palestinians are struggling. They're rising up. After 51 days of pounding them in Gaza, they started rising up again in Jerusalem and in Hebron, what you may have, remember as the individuals intifada. And then after trying to repress that for a while, there's another wave in Al-Aqsa Mosque and so on. So what have all these weapons achieved, really? And because they haven't, we can see the exports numbers going down. There is a decrease in Israeli weapons exports. And the Israeli companies become more desperate. 5 minutes, yeah? There's the story in Azerbaijan that I think is very important for me to tell you because it really shows the desperation of the Israeli arms industry. A company called Aeronautics wanted to sell the suicide drone. I'll explain what it is. And they came to Israeli company managers and 2 soldiers to demonstrate how the suicide drone is used. And the Azerbaijani officer said, oh, here over the hill, over the border with Armenia, there is a military outpost of Armenia. Blow this outpost for us and we'll buy the drone from you. So that's a problem, of course. You're not allowed when you're selling a product to kill people. But the Israeli soldiers that came with the delegation said, we're not going to do it. We're not going to start a war with Armenia to sell this drone. We're not firing. The managers, though, they really wanted to sell the drone. They were very desperate. They said to the soldiers, move aside, we will do it. Luckily, because they're managers and they have no idea what they're doing, they missed the target and nobody was killed, and at least we can be thankful for that. But the story did come out, and the aeronautics is now under investigation, and they have a serious problem. This really shows us this crisis of the Israeli security elite. They really have lost a lot of their influence over Israeli politics, and they also lost the ability to convince the world that Israel has the best security technology in the world as well. Actually, it was Amos Gilad, not Gadi Eisenkot, Amos Gilad who once said, we don't do Gandhi very well. When he said, what happens when Palestinians use nonviolent methods? We don't have an answer to that. But now, they can't admit anymore that they don't have an answer to the nonviolent struggle. And they say, when we're seeing what happens in Gaza, the commander of the army, Gadi Eisenkot, said, we are proud that our soldiers can shoot without being afraid. What does he mean by that? He means that he's terrified to impose discipline on his own soldiers. And what we see now in Gaza is Israeli soldiers just snipers using lethal force against Palestinian protesters, not using all of their sophisticated anti-riot technology, anti-demonstration technology that they're trying to sell and that they're developing for so many millions of dollars. They're not using that because the soldiers don't like to use that. And the soldiers say, we do what we want now. We are this new generation of colonialists. We don't take orders from you. And in the end, they're using the sniper rifles which are bought from the UK, from Britain. These are not Israeli sniper rifles, and they cannot then sell them. So, yeah, the suicide drone, maybe that would be my last point before concluding. The suicide drone is an interesting example of how this technology is really not about being effective, but about selling itself. The suicide drone has no military use. It's a very useless weapon. It's more expensive and less accurate than other kinds of drones or artillery and so on. it can hover in the air, and when it's given the command, it becomes a missile and falls on the ground, which means it tries to combine a drone and a missile for double the cost. Why is the Israeli industry developing these drones and selling them? Because they've identified a psychological need of Western generals in the US and also in Israel, of these generals who are really overgrown children playing with very dangerous toys, who say, well, we have all the advantage in technology when we're fighting against civilians. We have the best tanks and airplanes and artillery, but what we don't have is suicide bombers. That's the thing that our enemies have, but we don't. So now we have a robotic suicide bomber too. We have the suicide drone. And Azerbaijan is convinced, and they bought it. Yeah. Okay, so I'll just conclude by saying the Israeli arms industry plays a very important role in appealing to the right wing in the world by showing, look, we can offer a model. And it's no coincidence that the right wing in East Europe and in West Europe is very pro-Israeli, and in North America as well, of course. Trump himself mentioned how he would like to implement Israeli racial profiling technologies in the United States as well. He said that just before the elections. By saying, yeah, we are the experts in fighting terrorism, we are the expert colonialists, and if you want to be a colonialist, be like Israel and buy Israeli weapons. But when they're failing and they're not selling as many weapons, it shows that our protest is working, and it also shows that the Palestinian form of protest is also a kind of technology that the Israelis do not have an answer for yet. And for me, at least, that gives me a lot of hope. Thank you very much.